What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we are going to be covering the basics and fundamentals of the flying enemies in Deep Rock Galactic. A while ago I did a video covering the glyphid enemies, which was a lot of fun, so today I wanted to go over all of the flying enemies in the same way. Now when I say that, I mean I'm going to be covering the Mactera enemies as well as the Nadocyte family of enemies. Since there's much less flying enemies in this game than there are grounded enemies, I figured it was best to combine both of these families of enemies into one video. Keep in mind I am not going to be talking about the Rockpox variations of a lot of these enemies, as I'm going to save that for their own separate video, and I'm going to do the same thing talking about robots as well as stationary or other unique enemies. So to make sure you don't miss them, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so that way you never miss another upload. So talking about all of the flying enemies in a blanket way, the main core flying enemies that you're going to be fighting are the Mactera family of enemies, with the Nadocyte family sprinkled in every here and there. They are probably the second most common type of enemies that you're going to find throughout the course of the missions, being sprinkled in with the glyphids throughout swarms, or if you have something like Mactera Plague, you are going to be finding the Mactera way more often than glyphids in that particular case as well. Now the flying enemies obviously have a bit of an advantage over the glyphids, as they can hit you from more problematic angles, and cover is significantly more important when fighting these guys, as they are able to hit you from significantly more cheeky angles. Thankfully there's not nearly as many variations of these types of enemies as there are for the glyphids, so there's much less that we need to go over. Now one thing to briefly mention when talking about flying enemies overall is that there is a bit of a cheese way to handle essentially any flying enemy in the game, and that is cryo damage. Cryo damage is especially powerful against flying enemies because if any flying enemy, whether it be a Mactera or a Nadocyte, is frozen solid, they will die instantly because they will fall to the ground and shatter. So going throughout the course of this entire video, keep that in the back of your mind that I'm not going to be mentioning that for every specific enemy because I'm mentioning it right here, but cryo damage is a very good way to handle flying enemies overall. So things like the Driller's cryo cannon, the Scout's cryo grenades are phenomenal ways to handle that. But if you don't have access to any of those particular tools, there are other ways that you can handle them, which we're going to be talking about next. So similar to the last video with the glyphids, these specific things I'm going to be talking about each individual enemy are as follows: how common they are, or if they are in any specific biome or not in a specific biome, their base health value, which is the health value that they have before any sort of hazard level or difficulty multipliers are put in. So this is their base flatline health value, their weaknesses or resistances, if they have any weak points that they might have, any type of armor that they might have, any sort of special attacks or moves that they might have, good ways to deal with them, and then lastly, their priority level. So without further ado, let's get started, and the first thing that we're going to talk about is the Mactera spawn. So the Mactera spawn is the baseline bread and butter flying enemy that you're going to fight most of the time whenever there's Mactera that are flying around. They are the Glyphid Grunt equivalent to the flying family, and they are relatively easy to take out. They can spawn in any biome and are pretty common. They have a base health value of 223, which is a rather specific health number. They're weak to explosive, fire, corrosive, piercing, and melee damage, although meleeing these guys might be a little bit difficult. Their weak point is their stomach, and they don't have any armor to speak of. Now, the Mactera spawns have two, special attacks that you could consider. The first is their classic spit attack, where they just fire a ranged projectile towards the player. And the second isn't necessarily an attack, but it's more of a mobility tool where they quickly dash in a certain direction in order to disorient the player so that way they can't hit them. Neither one of these attacks are incredibly powerful, nor are they too problematic to deal with, as simply staying mobile can help you avoid their attacks relatively well. For strategy, again, moving around is probably your best bet when handling these guys. They have to stand still and charge up their sting shot in order to use it. So this makes them a sitting duck in the process, so you're able to take them out relatively quickly during this time. And also, if you are able to stun them before they get the shot off, then they have to restart the cycle. Again, since their weak point is very obvious and they don't have a whole lot of armor, just take them out really quickly when they try to shoot you, and you shouldn't have too much trouble. The only real problematic thing about these guys is that a lot of them will spawn at once, so it might be more of a case of strength in numbers, at least with these particular enemies. For priority levels, similar to the Glyphid Grunts that I talked about last time, I'd say they're pretty high just for sheer volume. Again, these are going to be the most common Mactera enemies that you're going to fight, so you're going to want to take them out relatively quickly just because there's going to be a lot of them. Next up, we have the Mactera Brundle. The Mactera Brundle is more or less the same exact thing as the Mactera spawn, however, it's a little bit beefier. Again, they can spawn in any biome and again are fairly common, albeit a little bit less common than the spawns themselves. They have 600 health, so that's a lot more than the normal spawn. Again, they are weak to explosive, fire, corrosive, and melee damage, but again, melee damage might be a little bit tough to hit these guys with. Their weak point is the same as the spawn with being the stomach. However, there is heavy armor that is surrounding the stomach, so you will need to punch through it before you can hit it. And in terms of special attacks, they have the exact same projectile move as the spawn. However, they are lacking the dash attack since they are significantly heavier. And the strategy for them is more or less the same as the normal spawn. You just need to have a little bit stronger punch to be able to get through their armor and expose their weak spot. And for priority level, it's more or less the same as the Mactera spawn, since they are so very common, maybe slightly higher because they are a little bit tougher to take out. Next up, we have the Mactera Trijaw. The Trijaw is kind of like the inverse to the Brundle. The Mactera spawn is the grunt, and the Mactera Brundle is the guard, and then the Mactera Trijaw is basically the slasher, or I guess the spitter, depending on which way you want to look at it. Again, they can spawn in any biome and are fairly common as well. They have a base health of 350, they are weak to explosive, fire, corrosive, and melee damage again. Their weak point is again their stomach, and they don't have any armor to speak of. Now, the Trijaw only have one attack called the Triple Barrage, in which it fires out a burst of 3 acidic spines. There is a delay in between each spine, so you can dodge them in between, and they do have slight spread to them, but there is still a relatively high chance that you will get hit. The barrage spines also have a small explosive radius that might not necessarily be too easy to detect at first, but they do have a bit of a blast to them. And essentially, the strategy for these guys is more or less the same as what we talked about with the spawn and the Brundle. Since they don't have armor, they're very easy to take out, albeit these guys make it a little bit tougher just because they are significantly more aggressive and will shoot you more often than the other two. And for priority level, I would say they're pretty high because similar to the spawns, they do show up in groups, and because these guys hit significantly harder, they can actually melt you very quickly, especially on the higher hazard levels. Moving on to the big targets, first we have the Goo Bomber. The Mactera Goo Bomber is a much bigger, much chunkier threat that thankfully you won't have to deal with too often. They can spawn in any biome except for the glacial strata, but that's because it has its own unique variant, which I'll talk about a little later. And they are fairly common. If you're going to be going up against a Mactera swarm, chances are at least 1 or 2 of these guys will be there with you. They have a base health value of 800, and they are weak to corrosive and melee damage. Their weak points are their 2 glowing sacks that they have on the bottom, and they don't have any armor to speak of. So the Goo Bomber has 2 different attacks that it can use. Its blob shot is where it simply fires off a goo projectile and has a decent amount of range, and the goo barrage is where it moves forward while dropping a trail of goo on the ground, kind of like a carpet bomber. Now, the strategy with the Goo Bomber is actually quite simple because they are very weak in their goo sack weak points. Unlike other weak points, the goo sacks actually have their own health value, and once you hit them enough, they will actually be destroyed. This will do a good chunk of damage to the Goo Bomber itself, and it will also disable it from using its goo barrage attack. Also, normally when the Goo Bomber dies, it will spin around wildly until it hits the ground and leave behind a pool of goo wherever it lands. However, if the weak points are destroyed, it does not leave any goo behind and will just crash into the ground. So essentially, the best course of action to handle these guys is to take out their weak points as fast as possible, which is relatively easy because they are very easy to spot. For priority level, I'd say they're fairly high because you won't see too many of these guys around. Again, you'll see probably 1 or 2 during any sort of particular swarm, and so long as you take out the sacks that they have, they really aren't going to be too much of an issue for you. Then, to quickly cover the other variant of the Goo Bomber, we have the Frost Bomber. As I said before, the Goo Bomber cannot spawn on the glacial strata. Instead, it is replaced with this particular variant. The Frost Bomber is more or less a carbon copy of the Goo Bomber, except for instead of dropping goo or firing goo projectiles, it just launches frost and drops frost projectiles, which instead of slowing you down, will freeze you solid and deal cryo damage to you. The only difference it has stat-wise is that it is now resistant to cryo damage. However, you can still freeze this and knock it out of the air normally, which is still kind of hilarious, but that's the only real stat difference that this thing has. Other than that, it is essentially the exact same thing as the Goo Bomber, and as such follows the exact same attack style, strategy, and priority level as its non-fraught counterpart. Next up, we have everybody's favorite jump scare, the Mactera Grabber. The Grabber is by far probably one of the most scariest enemies in the game for new players especially, but even for veterans it can still sneak up on you and can give you a little bit of a blood pressure spike whenever you hear the sound. It can spawn on any biome and is relatively uncommon in terms of Mactera spawns. During a particular wave, you might have 1 of these things, maybe 2 if you're unlucky, but for the most part, they're relatively uncommon. They have a base health value of 500. They are only weak to melee damage, which is a bit odd. Their weak point is the very bottom of their stomach, and they don't have any armor to speak of. So in terms of attacks, the Grabber doesn't actually have an attack at all. It doesn't attack in the traditional sense. Instead, what it does is it tries to grab and displace players. Essentially, it'll fly around idly until it decides it wants to grab somebody, or as the game describes it, it is the hug attack, which I think is just hilarious. And when it performs this attack, it will let out its trademark scream, which sends shivers down many players' spines.
Oh, hell no!
Before then making a beeline for whatever player it is currently targeted with its arms up ready to grab them. Now it's relatively quick, and if it does make contact with the player, it will wrap all of its claws around them and pull them away from the group. It'll fly them around until it reaches a high enough point to where it could drop the player to their doom, where in which case you will most likely die from fall damage. Now, if you're able to hit the grabber before it's able to grab anybody, it will stop the attack and it will need to retry. If it does grab you, the only ways that you can get out are for your allies to damage the grabber, for Bosco to damage the grabber, or if you have the Heightened Senses perk, you can break out yourself. The best way to really counter these guys is just to stay together because it can't grab two of you at once, and to just be on alert, and whenever you hear the trademark scream, keep your head on a swivel and take it out whenever you get to see it. For priority level, I'd say they're pretty high because they can seriously disrupt the team, and in a course of a big swarm, if one of these guys grabs one of your teammates and drops them from a tall height in a spot that is very inconvenient for you guys to get to, it can seriously mess up the team. Next, we have the very small but also still effective family of Nadosite enemies, and the first thing we have is the Nadosite Shocker. In my opinion, the worst enemy in the entire game. These things they're just the worst. No, they're not the most oppressive thing in the entire world, and no, they're not as powerful as, say, an oppressor or a bulk detonator, but they are just absolutely annoying. For spawning, they can only spawn in the dense biozone or the glacial strata biomes, which is very nice. They have a base health value of only 5, so they are the weakest of all the flying enemies. They don't have any weaknesses or resistances, no weak points, and no armor. For attacks, they just have one attack, and that is they just fly up and shock you. And because anywhere from 8 to 10 of these guys spawn at a time, there will be a ton of them shocking you, which can surprisingly take you out very quickly. They also can just literally pop out of nowhere. You will be walking through the cave, and then all of a sudden 10 to 12 of these guys will show up out of literally nowhere and then start flying up to you and shocking you. This makes them very annoying to deal with. Not necessarily, again, the most powerful thing in the world, just really annoying. The best strategy to take these guys out is to have really heavy AoE, or one of my favorite things to take against these guys is the Thorns perk. Does it fix the issue of these guys? No, but it definitely helps out a lot. For priority level, actually I would say that they're fairly high just because of the amount of damage they can do very quickly, but personally I'd say that they're the highest because they are just insanely annoying, pop out of nowhere, and they're just the worst. I do not like these guys. And finally, we have the biggest of the flying enemies, the Nadosite Breeder. The Breeder is one of the biggest and most imposing enemies in the entire game, at least from a design standpoint. It is a very cool looking design, and it has a really unique position in the flying enemy family. It can spawn on any biome, however, it can only spawn at map creation. What that means is that when you first load in a mission and it loads in the entire caves, that is when it will spawn in any Nadosite breeders, which basically means that they cannot spawn randomly throughout the course of the run like other enemies can. Essentially, that means that once you clear out the cave of any Nadosite breeders that are already there, you cannot get more of them later on. They have a base health value of 1500. They don't have any weaknesses or resistances. Their weak point is their mouth, and they don't have any armor to speak of. Similar to the grabber, the Nadosite breeder does not have any attacks of its own. It doesn't actually try to attack the player. Instead, it breeds. To be specific, what it actually does is it drops these eggs out of their mouth called the Nadosite roe. The roe are basically the eggs that it lays, and if left unattended for a certain amount of time, the roe will then hatch into a group of Nadosite hatchlings. The hatchlings are essentially the exact same thing as the Nadosite shockers, except for instead of shocking you, they just fly up to you and sting you, which makes them significantly less irritating than the shockers. Now this makes it a little bit more awkward because the weak point that the Nadosite breeder has, its mouth, is only really available while it is actively laying eggs. Other than that, it is covered up and much harder to hit. So the strategy for taking these guys out is relatively simple. They're slow moving, they don't really try to get away from you, so you can kind of just lay into them as they're trying to lay eggs. The only real strategy you need is to have somebody to constantly take out the roe eggs before they hatch into the hatchlings, otherwise you'll be dealing with both them and their spawn at the same time. Also, I don't know about anybody else, but for me personally, I feel like whenever I see one of these guys, there's always 2 or 3 of them in the same room. I know that they spawn at the beginning of the map creation, but I feel like they're always in the exact same spot. So typically you're going to have to deal with multiple sets of hatchlings if you let them get out of control. For priority level, I'd say that they're pretty high because, as I said, they can swarm you by hatching eggs, and if left unchecked, they can double or even triple the size of the swarms that you are going to have to deal with. Well, hopefully now you understand the flying enemies of Deep Rock Galactic just a little bit better, and maybe you won't be so scared the next time you hear that grabber headed your way. And anyway, I hope you guys found this video helpful. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and consider becoming a member as it really helps me out a lot. Rocket Stone Miners, I'll see you in the next video.